I just don't like the idea of there's like a right way and a wrong way. There's a bug, there's a fix, there's a, like there's just one way of doing it. I don't think that that's real, especially in this technology world that we're heading into.
Hi, and welcome to the HearSay podcast. I'm your host, Mike Paciello, Chief Accessibility Officer here at AudioEye. Today, I'm joined by one of my good longtime friends and colleagues, Bryce Johnson. Bryce is a principal researcher of accessibility and inclusive design at Microsoft, and he also holds the distinction of being the co-inventor of the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which, as you'll find out today, one of many things and contributions that to the accessibility industry that Bryce has been involved in. Hey, Bryce, good to talk to you again, buddy. Glad to have you here with us on HearSay.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Mike.
Hey, listen, before we dive into our conversation, why don't you give us kind of the elevator 30,000 foot pitch of who you are and, what your professional life has been, especially where you've been at Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, I think really quickly, I started like many people do in web accessibility. I think a catalyst for me was I was the designer of the first digital library for the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. From that, started at Microsoft, always worked on accessibility. I was the annoying guy in the meeting talking about accessibility all the time. We started working on assistive technologies for Xbox just before the launch of Xbox One. That was something I worked on with a woman named Evelyn Thomas. And, so all the things like narrator and closed captions, and magnifier and controller remapping, those were things that we did. And while we were doing that, we had to recognize that our beloved Xbox controller was actually unintentionally excluding people. So we did a hackathon and we created what is the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Cool. We think we call this the adaptive controller because we wanted to take a nod back to when AT was more commonly known as adaptive technology instead of assistive technology. We wanted to think of like, how do our devices and how do our services adapt to you? While we did all that, I basically was one of the co-founders of the Inclusive Tech Lab. I'm going to give you a little spin. I'm in the Inclusive Tech Lab right now.
Very nice.
This is a facility that we have on the Microsoft campus to work intentionally with the disability community. And now my role is basically transitioned. I think, I like to sort of tell people who work a lot in accessibility, like, you make your things work with AT. I make AT, right? And I think it's a really different kind of mindset that I'm starting to lean into as we think about how to empower disabled individuals in the future is embracing that idea of like, we're not accommodating to work with like assistive technologies. We're going to make new things. And I think that's really exciting.
I caught a phrase that you mentioned there about technology adapting, right? There's thus the notion of adaptive rather than assistive technology.
Right.
Well, a couple of things along those lines. First and foremost, your role right now, as I understand it, involves interaction design. So explain a little bit about interaction design, adaptive design as it relates, and inclusive design. Separate the three if you can.
Yeah, I mean, our inclusive design practice started with a bunch of interaction designers, and I'm a designer. And when we, a lot of people have heard about Kat Holmes's book Mismatch. That started from our practice.
Yep.
Kat started this practice with a man named August de los Reyes, who I worked for at the time. And August always had this really interesting point of view about the difference between, I think, traditional accessibility and what we thought of as inclusive design, whereas traditional accessibility is there is a problem, like there's a barrier and then there's a facilitator to get you over the barrier. There's a bug and there's a fix. And we were aspirationally trying to get to a place of what if we just didn't create the bugs to begin with? And I think we're still on that journey, right? I think one of the things that I like to say and hear a lot, and I've written it in my guide, Devices, Accessories, and Augmentation, is that all accessibility really is personalization that takes into account human diversity.
Exactly.
So I think like, there's so many things. And I have a colleague, Aaron Gostofferson. A lot of you might know him. He's big in the accessibility space. Aaron said that one thing that really struck a note with me a long time ago. He's like, my phone computer and my PC computer don't care what the interface is. So therefore, responsive design, something that we all do all the time, is accessibility. It's not about the device. It's about the person,
Right.
right? It's about the context that I'm in, and it's about how I'm interacting with the interface. So I don't know if I answered your questions like directly, but I think that's, interaction design and inclusive design in many ways, at least in my world. Like, I'm an interaction designer that specializes in disability. And I even remember many, many, many years ago, I was at a conference with Derek Featherstone, and he was at a design conference. And Derek was like, I don't know if I belong here. I'm an accessibility guy. And I'm like, accessibility is design. Like, you just have a specific market. It's interesting how we talk about these boxes, right? Like, like they're very common in the industry. You're a designer or you're a researcher, but
Right.
you can't do inclusive design without people with disabilities, right? Like, there is no inclusive design without Nothing About Us Without Us.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you can't fit into a box of like, I'm a designer, I'm a researcher. And when
Right.
people try to force that box, I don't like it.
Yeah.
So
No, I hear you. Yeah, and that's what creates part of the problem, because I think really at the broader level, this is maybe fundamentally one of the things that technologists and researchers, of any type of interface, right? It really doesn't matter what the interface is. Don't get yet. I still think that with all of the awareness building and all the work that professionals like yourself, myself, and going long back before all of us, we've been trying to drive home, and people don't get it. They just don't understand how they could design, an interface so that it is usable and accessible, at least by the broadest spectrum of folks that are interacting with it.
So, Mike, I agree 100%. And I take it another way too. Even the people who benefit from accessibility, like, they live in the same world as the people who we're trying to convince, right? So we actually spend a lot of time basically trying to build awareness for the disabled community. And I think the one thing that really shook us with the adaptive controller, right, was that we were working with like able gamers and special effect and all these people who wanted to game. And
Right.
then we brought it out into the world, and then there was like 10 times more people who never even considered gaming, right? And so, it's so funny. It's like that quote, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? Like, I think that there are solutions for all kinds of disabled folks. The awareness challenge is really tricky. And that's both like from a stakeholder point of view and from a developer point of view and from like the end user point of view.
No, I totally get it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I was involved in labs and user research and usability testing, and it was amazing to me how little thought was really put into assistive and adaptive devices in the early days of technology. Right? I mean, if you
Right.
look at a screen reader, we'll just take probably the most common, accessibility or assistive interface and application that's out there today that people, it kind of resonates with most people. If you were to design a screen reader today, I just don't think that we would approach it the way that it was when Jaws, when Ted Ender came
Right.
out with Jaws.
And then you have a community of people who've learned that and think it's the best way.
Yeah,
I mean, I've been working with American Printing House from the Blind and a lot of state-run blind schools. And it's amazing to me that so many people who are my age, with this big gray beard, who are blind, are telling me what students in school need. And I'm like,
right.
you didn't have a computer when you were in school. Like,
Yeah,
you're my age.
right,
So
right.
I totally agree with you. It's wild to think that the paradigm of a modern screen reader was built in a command line era. And I'm trying to explain how this works to young people who've never even seen command line. It's
Yeah, on a
wild.
board, on a motherboard,
Yeah.
on top of it, right? It was on a board. Remember the old deck talks?
Yeah.
So, yeah, yeah, you're right. Well, we could easily go into history on a lot of different things, but so this really kind of tackles another problem. So, from your perspective, then what really separates great design from good design?
I it's funny. I must admit, I was thinking about this morning. You know that quote that Merrill Evans always like talks about, like, progress over perfection, right?
Right.
You
Yep.
know, I think that that's really important. We've been fortunate enough here to ship a number of great kind of hardware devices and software stuff too. But I always tell people, "Oh man, you should see what we didn't ship." Like all the stuff that
Yeah.
doesn't make it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so I think you have to celebrate the wins, right? And I think that's also a really that's also a kind of a hard thing to do when you have a community that is intricately tied to advocacy, right? Is this
Yep.
idea of like, we got to celebrate the wins.
Right.
And I think that, I mean, that especially comes up in gaming because I think, in most of I watch people in gaming intentionally do things that cause them pain because they like it, right? Like people with disabilities, like let's say, you've got a game and you've got ADHD and like you can't handle a lot of like noise. But the thing is the noise is the fun part, right?
Yeah.
So people in gaming constantly push themselves. Everyone in gaming does this, but people with disabilities do it too. They push themselves to an edge. And for folks who are disabled, that edge can sometimes be painful, right? And but
Yeah.
you can't tell them, you can't stop them. That's what the whole point is, right? It's
I think
wild.
that's such a great point. I honestly believe what you just said there is gaming has always provided um, a nice backdrop and a forum for forcing um, errors, if you will, right?
Right.
To kind of move things out to the edge to see, what this will do, what will do, what happens if I do this, what happens if I do that, that type of thing. But it's the perfect product design environment and interface environment for actually doing that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
most accessibility is about this idea of eliminating barriers, right? But if you eliminated the barriers from a game, it wouldn't be a game, right? That's what games are. They're barriers, right? You just so it's about tuning the barrier. It's about right sizing the barrier. And I think that's where it becomes really interesting. We're not in this world anymore of like this works, this doesn't. It's like, no, this there's a slider, right, of
yeah,
how much this works, right? It's
yeah.
it's a spectrum.
Do you find still in just mainstream engineering and development that there are still a lot of misperceptions amongst designers and developers when it comes to developing or designing an accessible interface or product?
I don't want to say misconceptions because there's been a lot of great work. You and I have been on this journey a long time. We've seen a lot of great advocates do a lot of great work. I
Mm,
do I do like people to and now that I've got newer people on the team sort of starting, I have to teach them all these like fundamentals before I kind of go, okay, now just realize that a lot of this is dogma and you can like
right.
basically like you can question it, right? You don't have to these aren't like hard and fast rules, or at least you should understand what is a hard and fast rule and what isn't, right? And so it's I know that's a very kind of wishy-washy answer, but it is that idea of like I do think that I just don't like the idea of there's like a right way and a wrong way. There's a bug, there's a fix, there's like there's just one way of doing it. I don't think that that's real, especially in this technology world that we're heading into.
Yeah. Yeah. With AI, VR, augmented reality, and things along those lines. I
Yeah.
wonder, Bryce, um, if you kind of feel uh, the way that I do that it's easier to design and develop if you work by principles of design and
Yeah.
development as opposed
Sure.
to stringent rules, standards, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, I could code to a standard, right? But in the end, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? Fundamentally, it's a principle, right?
Yeah.
It's is this usable, accessible, and now I throw in equitable because of AI to a blind person, to a low vision person, to a person with fine motor control. Is it to an individual who's got some sort of disability where it relates to their voice or shaking and things along those lines? That does that make sense to you?
Oh, completely. And I mean, that's how design works, right? Design works on principles. No
Right.
designer wants someone to come up and tell them what to do. But at
Yeah.
the same time, they all want tangible guidance in a world where they might not feel comfortable in this space. So you have to find that balance, right? Like how do you act like a muse to a designer on behalf of the disability community
Yeah.
without without sort of stifling that designer, or get them to paint by numbers, basically, right? I think it's a very tricky problem, and a lot of accessibility people understandably feel like they have the answers, but that's just not a good way to go into a design problem. Kind of like, I mean, even the greatest creative briefs are aspirational. They're not specs.
Yep.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I totally agree. Um, it's why I fought so hard. I remember Jim Tobias and I, when we were chairing the 5-Way committee, we fought hard to eliminate all the rules and just rely on the functional performance criteria, because those are
Yeah.
principles. That's what they are.
Yeah.
But we lost. We lost because
Well,
industry fought against that.
yeah, I know. And
Mm.
I get that too.
Yeah.
We put some tactile bumps on the back of Xbox consoles,
Right.
for ports, so that blind
Yep.
people can figure out what the ports are. And we've
Yeah.
been trying to
Yep.
push that with our device partners. So, I work with like Lenovo and Dell and Asus has put some on their devices, and other companies are looking at doing it too. But you're right. There's this attitude where they show up and they go, well, what's the spec? And I go, but I don't know what your device is. Like, so I want to give you, like, I don't want to, I'm not trying to stifle it. Like, I think with the tactile bumps, one of the things that we learned too is that you really didn't want them to be, you didn't want them to be so precise that they could be misinterpreted. So for an example, like if any tactile bump felt like Braille at all, we were heading in the wrong direction, right? Like,
Interesting.
no,
Yeah. Right.
like, so you take what's good about Braille, like dot height and those types of familiarity things, but you're not trying to make a character. Like if I had a blind person trying to read the back of a device like it was Braille, wrong direction.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I wonder, have you fooled around with the Monarch or the Cadence at all?
I've seen the Monarch, and I've talked to, and Greg showed it to me a couple times at APH. I haven't
Yeah.
seen the Cadence, but
Yeah.
the Monarch is exciting.
Yeah.
It's a wild space, right? Like I must admit, I'm like, when you start to think about tactile graphics, I guess I have questions, right? Like, because you're talking about some members of this audience who've never seen something, so I don't know what tactile graphics can kind of be in that space. I don't know. I definitely need some more deep dives into this world of tactile graphics.
The cadences are kind of cool because they're modular in form, in terms of the hardware. But you could take 4 of these units, put them together, and you functionally get a Monarch, right?
Oh, that's cool.
But
That's really cool.
yeah,
I haven't
it's very
Yeah,
cool.
I haven't really seen that, so that's cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for the folks in the audience, we're talking about 2 products, the Monarch, which is basically produced and shipped by Humanware and some of their partners, including APH. And Cadence is a device, also a portable mobile Braille device. These are Braille devices that do tactile graphics and in 3D, and work off of 3D Braille for the blind. And this is kind of the new and upcoming device for students. K through 12 is where it's being marketed right now, and then eventually it'll get up into post-secondary. So that's just to give you a little bit of insight there. But let me come back to something else I wanted to ask you, because this was always one of my challenges, and I'm interested to see your perspective. Now being, how long have you been at Microsoft now?
I've been told recently I've been here 15 years. There was
Yeah,
a slide
yeah,
celebrating it and everything. So.
cool. All right, cool. So in the 15 years that you've been at Microsoft, have you seen um, a prioritization of accessibility in the corporation? I mean, Jenny talks about it a lot.
Yeah.
CEO talks about it a lot, but do you see that? And why is it so hard? Because I definitely thought I was up against this when I was at DEC, and then a couple of years ago I did it at Pearson, same kind of thing. And this was with one-on-one conversations with Ken Olson founder of DEC and the CEO of Pearson. How to get them to, just get it even into the top 10 priorities of the company? How do we do that? How have you done it?
I mean, Jenny's done a wonderful job prioritizing it across the country or across the company.
Yeah.
And so what I will say is someone who's been on this journey while all that was happening. But I am a designer, so I don't want to pretend like I'm speaking for Microsoft or everybody.
Right.
But like I think it's really interesting because it does come back to that awareness thing. The friction, no one here at Microsoft would ever say accessibility is not important. And I was here when they did say that, right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
in Xbox, there was a time when you'd bring it up and people would be like, not a priority. But no one would ever say that at Microsoft now. But that doesn't mean that they intrinsically understand the needs of the disabled, So we talked about this awareness thing a little bit, right? For a lot of designers, every designer needs to take their stakeholders on a journey, right? To like pitch their idea. But for a lot of designers, it's like, hey, don't you find it annoying when this doesn't work as you'd expect? And everyone's like, oh, yeah, okay. Right. And then I show up and I go, let's talk about cerebral palsy. And then the room's like, what's cerebral palsy? Like, what? I can't put myself in that shoes. Right.
Right.
And that's one thing that, we talk about empathy a lot in the community in general. But I always liked what like Matt May always had to say about empathy. Like he didn't believe in empathy, he believed in like altruism and compassion. Right. And I
Yeah.
fully stand behind that. Like I think empathy is a trap only because I've seen so many executives take the emotion and forget the circumstance, right? Because it is all really natural for us to try to contextualize things in our own worldview. And you think that that's empathy, but it isn't. It's like
Mm.
it's a trap, right? So that's not, nothing about us without us isn't I'm going to be blind today, right?
Right.
Or I'm going to put myself in a blind person's shoes. That's not what that is.
Mhm.
What's wild about what we do is that we have to take people on this journey, but people have short attention spans,
Mhm.
right? So you can't sit someone down and go, "Hey, let me tell you about limited mobility and the intricacies of interrelated need across across certain disabilities." And so what I mean by that interrelated need, we talk about synthesis a lot here in our design process, right? Like I'm not trying to fix a bug, I'm trying to solve a bunch of things at once, right?
Mhm.
So with this guy, I will tell everyone, because I say this all the time. We started with vets, first of all. So vets who are injured typically tend to be like limb different or spinal cord injury or a combination of both.
Right.
We moved on to cerebral palsy. And so when you look at all those things, it's people with limited mobility who have a lack of fine motor control. So that's why everything's so big, right? Because they
Mhm.
couldn't use the small controller. And that's why, you plug a switch in, to this, and you put the switch where you have movement because you don't have fine motor control. So where this gets a little bit weaker, but we're still okay, is when you talk about muscular dystrophy or spinal muscular atrophy. You talk about conditions where you only have fine motor control and you do not have gross motor control. We do
Right.
okay with this there, but we could do better. And that doesn't mean that we think about this interrelated need across these things. I mean, I must admit, I joke sometimes with with my colleagues who are blind. Blindness is pretty easy to understand. I can see, I can't see, I can sort of see. Like it's a spectrum, but it's a fairly linear spectrum.
Right.
Whereas a lot of these other disabilities, the spectrums aren't linear. I mean, the autism spectrum is not linear, right? Like,
Right. 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 Of course. Of course. From my standpoint, I felt like I needed to put people in the position of an individual with a disability. And I think it's so ironic that in your example before, you said you started with vets. And my
yeah,
history goes all the way back to what Dinah Cohen, was with the Department of what do they call it? Not war, but uh, I forget. with the military, and
Oh, okay.
right, so they actually would recruit individuals with disabilities to design interfaces, and the way that they did that was they basically wanted to mimic what did it mean if for whatever someone in the military suddenly went blind or could not hear,
Right.
or they were completely immobile. How would they work and still be able to work their devices? So kind of reverse engineering, if you will, from that standpoint. And I always felt that when I introduced a study, and someone would develop an application, and we would have them watch the usability testing that we would do on that application as it was being tested by persons with disabilities. And I'll tell you what empathy does. If it does nothing else, never mind the emotional part of it, it creates aha moments, a lot of aha
Right.
moments, because they will
Yeah.
look there and watch and realize, do this, do this. I've literally saw people get up and shake the windows or pound on the glass that they could get through,
Sure.
right, because of that. So I don't know. That's I'm still kind of
No,
a cheerleader for it.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't want to be. I think what it brings up is just it's really hard to kind of explain when you work on something like Windows, um,
Right.
which is used by like 1.4 billion people. Like you really are trying to build something for everybody, and it's very difficult to always put this stuff in the right context. But I agree with you. I don't think you're, and I appreciate your example of the military designing interfaces because I mean the idea of designing for permanent, temporary, and situational disability bring. I first was introduced to that idea in Matt and Wendy's book, right?
Yep.
As it was laid out in that way. I mean, I don't know if they invented it, but that's where I saw it first,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I do really like what you're saying because you're right. Like warfighters are very situationally impaired. And there's a lot that can be learned from like those types of situations that through the context of disability can be really empowering.
Exactly. So, and the beauty of that is they're not individuals with disabilities, but they are put into a position where they functionally are disabled, right?
Right.
So that always
Hmm.
made a lot. You know who else did a lot of that? By the way, I said Department of War. It's Department of Defense. Dinah Cohen. She passed away a few years ago, but she was awesome. Um, uh, NASA. NASA did the
Yeah.
same thing. They did the same kind of testing, putting astronauts in a position where they functionally were mimicking, what an individual with a disability was already experiencing for a lifetime. And as a result, they designed interfaces that were more usable and self-adapting. So Microsoft now, I mean, truly is considered, if not the leader, definitely in the top two or three companies worldwide of being very pro advocates in terms of accessibility and disability. How do you think? Why do you think that is?
I mean, we have a responsibility, right? Our mission here is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And with Jenny's advocacy across the company and that mission, it's undeniable that we can't ignore the disabled. And the scope of what we do is so huge. So we do think about responsibility a lot. There's that famous Tim Cook quote where it's like we don't make our products accessible for the blind for the bloody ROI, right? Like
Right.
that is true, right? But I must admit, we're just at different. I think us and a lot of the people that I talk to, we're at different parts of our journey. Because I must admit, now I've been really digging into to looking at prevalence data and things like the World Health Organization's international classification of function, because I don't think we're going to reach that mission of empower everyone unless we look at data, right? So
That's a
we
good
were at a
point.
point we were at a point where we didn't have to use data to prove that accessibility was important. And we are at that point. We don't do that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use data to guide our strategy, right? Because it's such an awesome scope. Like and
Yeah.
and when I talk about interrelated need and synthesis, right? It's this idea of like you're never going to reach that scope if you just are checking off bugs. If you're just identifying bugs and knocking them down, you've got to think, you've got to step back, right? You got to take a look at a bigger picture, and you got to look at need, and you have to figure out those ideas. And, there's all kinds of interactions, I think, along that, right? Like what you're talking about, what we were just talking about with the situational things of warfighters is really cool. And you can apply a lot of that to, like, let's say like a low vision blind community. But you also have advocates in that blind community who have a way of doing things, and they have their list of needs. And so one of the interesting things as an interaction designer is to think about when precision in an interface is important, when proficiency is important, and when it isn't, right?
Right.
Like, let me give you like an example that I think about all the time. We used to talk in the web accessibility world about how a blind person wanted to find out the weather that day, right? And so what they do, they'd go to their PC, they'd fire up their PC, they'd load up like a screen reader, they'd go to a web browser, they'd go to a website, they'd navigate the website, they'd find out what the weather was that day, using all the tools that we were told were important for that screen reader user and that website. And then what do they do today? Hey, Alexa, what's the weather going to be like today?
Yeah.
Right. So there are tons of scenarios that we used to think were super important that will eventually just fade away. Some things, it's important to be precise, right? Like if you're reading an annual report, you probably want to be precise.
Right.
You want that control. But sometimes you just might want to go, hey, I just need an answer to this kind of simple question, right? Can you just give it to me?
Yeah.
Like, summarize this term paper for me.
Yeah.
Right. What does this person have to say? And then dig in when you want to go forward.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of interactions that I think are really going to open up
as we move forward. And I definitely appreciate your point. I'll tell you, one of the things that I've appreciated about the folks here at AudioEye is data is a true motivator here. It really is a thing that's pushing where we go, what we do, and why we do it. So, Bryce, what ways do you think accessibility can enhance a company's brand reputation and reach a broader audience?
I mean, I believe that our motivations are genuine. And I must admit, I'm not personally motivated by, because I don't have to be, by this idea of enhancing the brand. But I will say that there are lots of people at the company who are. We made the adaptive controller. Our marketing team recognized how important it was. They made a Super Bowl ad for the adaptive controller, right? It was probably one of the biggest ads that Microsoft has ever done in terms of like reach and success. It was definitely one of the most awarded ads that they've ever done. So that, to an end user, there's a lot of awareness that's built up around that. But I always have to tell people that ad, that Super Bowl ad for the adaptive controller, was for Microsoft and not for the adaptive controller, because I still get people who go, well, how does this work? Right. So when you're advertising something like that and you're marketing something like that, you have to recognize the different things that people are going for. So I appreciate that our accessibility work encourages trust building, right? Like we want people to, I can understand why people think we're just like a monolithic kind of corporation, but we're made up of like me's, right? Like everyone here wants to do things. So, we have to tell those stories. So I also think for us, I think in one of the things that we can do to a larger industry is really just kind of hammer home the fact that this is a responsibility. This isn't, you don't do this solely for the fact that it's going to get you feel good points, right? That could be like a side benefit, but that's not what brings me into work every day, right? Like this is a responsibility we have to our customers.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great. Now we'll take it from the marketing side of this and brand reputation. Let's go back to my final question here as it relates to designers and developers. So, from your
Mhm.
perspective, just you being the expert here, what advice would you give designers or other content creators, for that matter, looking to bring accessibility into their design or development processes?
I think at a really fundamental level, I think it's really important to become a good storyteller. And I don't want to pretend that I am a good storyteller, but like I was sort of saying earlier, a lot of design challenges are pretty universal, and they can be, and the motivation and the principles behind them can be explained to a larger group of stakeholders pretty easily. I'm literally taking people on a journey that's basically the Odyssey. We're talking about human diversity, right? And yet I have to parse it out in ways that can be quickly digested. No one's going to read like a 10-page paper before the meeting, right? So you do have to tell stories, and that does work both ways, right? Like, again, like, it works internally with our stakeholders and our designers and our developers and all our peers, but it also works, when we go to those disabled communities who haven't had products intentionally designed for them. You have to tell the story. And typically in that case, you want to both ways. You want to bring in someone who can authentically tell the story. I'm not going to sit there and go, "Hey, I pretend I have cerebral palsy." I'm not going to do that, right? Like, so you bring in people who have the lived experience, but you figure out ways to quickly and optimally tell the story. That's what I think is the real secret. And I guess that's because I don't know if I'm there yet, and I've been doing it forever, right?
Yeah.
Like, because and the other thing about, like, when you're talking about designers and developers that is painful to me now is that you have to remember there's always new designers and developers, right? After 15 years, I've trained a lot of people up and they've moved on, and then I've got new people. And so when you think about regressions that can happen in an application, right? It's pretty easy to understand why it happens. Well, you got a whole new group of you ran through these issues, and you trained up the designers and developers. They fixed all the bugs, and then they moved on. They moved on to another project. And you got new people coming in, and then regressions happen, and you've got to do it all over again. And that I don't want to pretend that that is like just the way it is. I think we can solve that, but it's also something that's important to recognize. Every once in a while, I catch myself where I have to, like, remind myself I have to go back to 101, because I'm coming across as like, people don't understand what I'm saying. It's like, tone it down, professor. you know,
Yeah. But I totally get it. It's I think it's a part of being old. I hate to tell you, Bryce, I've been doing this for
yeah,
40 years now, but storytelling, I really appreciate that. Storytelling is really a key method of teaching, because it really does help people, as you say, come along the journey of where it was, how it is, and where it could be going. And I've always appreciate that. You always end up with lessons learned from that as well. So I definitely appreciate your point there. Hey, Bryce, it's been awesome talking with you. Really, thanks so much for coming on our HearSay show and sharing your insights and some of the storytelling, seeing some of the advances over the years, especially from two people that have been down the road a bit
yes,
in terms of accessibility, adaptive, and assistive technology.
yeah. Thanks, Mike. This is awesome.
Yeah. And for the rest of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to HearSay, and we'll see you in our next show. HearSay is produced by Sojin Rank, Mike Barton, Mariella, Paulino, and Missy Jensen. Edited by Alex Dorrier. If you enjoyed this podcast and don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.